This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Well, hey everyone, and thanks for tuning into When Science Speaks. Today's episode is brought to you by Bear Strategic Consulting in Washington, D.C., which uses true-to-life training and insider relationship building strategies to help scientists and engineers craft and communicate effectively to colleagues, policymakers, and potential employers. I am so thrilled that we have Trish Hall joining us today on the show. Trish served as the New York Times op-ed editor for almost 5 years, which means she was the person in charge of the Times op-ed page. And that's the page opposite the editorial page, which is where the term comes from, referring to when people used to read actual papers. But I still get the Times delivered on weekends, Trish. So I did read your recent op-ed in the actual newspaper, just for the record. In her role as op-ed editor, Trish oversaw a dozen editors who read submissions from across the spectrum of writers, from celebrities to unknowns, all wanting their voice to be heard. Besides her position as op-ed editor, Trish also worked as a Times senior editor, serving as a bridge between the business side and the newsroom, assistant managing editor, and also living style editor, where she oversaw food, home, and real estate coverage. In addition to writing and editing op-eds for clients who want to get their opinions out into the world, Trish now has a brand new book, which is called Writing to Persuade: How to Bring People Over to Your Side. It's available on Amazon and wherever fine books are sold. I was fortunate to receive an advanced copy of Writing to Persuade, and I have to tell you, it's great. It's entertaining if you like interesting behind the scenes stories about Angelina Jolie, Woody Allen, and other folks. But it's also an actionable resource. It's filled with specific tips and techniques that you can put to use right away. I highly recommend it. Trish, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Storytelling is a common element that scientists, engineers, and others often are told to incorporate in their written and oral presentations. But I loved how in your book you tell readers that they have to know, as you put it, which story to tell. Can you share with our listeners what you mean by that?
Yeah, I think that anyone who's trying to reach people has to understand that they have some expertise and they have some story that people might want to hear, and they shouldn't try to tell some other person's story or something that has nothing to do with what they do. I think in the book, it was in the context of Woody Allen writing about the sexual abuse charges against him. And he didn't write about all kinds of things. He really focused on the one thing that was really relevant at that moment. And I think sometimes people think, oh, I have to tell stories, and they just throw in these anecdotes, but it's a deeper thing than that. You have to know what your story is that will be relevant to that audience.
And you just mentioned in your response expertise, which is something that our listeners focus and think a lot about. And in Writing to Persuade, you emphasize the need to have expertise, just as you pointed out, in the topic that you're writing or you're speaking about. For scientists and engineers, sometimes this notion that they're not, quote, the expert, or they're not expert in this particular topic, stops them from interacting or sharing their opinions. But you talk about a broader interpretation of expertise that I think would really be valuable to our listeners. Can you share more about that?
I think a lot of general audiences have a lot of respect for scientists and engineers and doctors, and they do want to hear from them. And they trust their judgment partly because they are working on the ground in a very specific way. So that I, as a journalist, all I can do is go out and interview those people. So that I think scientists, as writers, need to have respect for what they know. Like one of our contributors was Oliver Sacks, and obviously he became famous by writing stories of real clients that had some resonance for a larger audience. So that's one way. But I think that some scientists and doctors are sometimes hesitant to write broadly from their own experience in addition to their research experience. And they shouldn't be because their work probably can link to people in some way that gives it a kind of universal appeal. And sometimes that requires going a little bit outside of their comfort zone and their research and drawing a conclusion. Because in op ed, we needed pieces that had an opinion. And that was actually the biggest problem I saw with scientists. They were sometimes reluctant to do a big conclusion, but they shouldn't be. They have every right to have that conclusion.
And that is, you put your finger on a major issue, is this conclusion or result, because I think in my work with scientists, there's this sentiment that research is always continuing and there's always another possibility, another experiment to run. There's another lab working on this halfway around the world, and they might find something different or completely the opposite or disprove what you're saying. So it can be a challenge. There are certain ways to do it in a way that's true to the science, but also consistent with exactly what you're talking about. People want to know, what's the result? What's the real world impact?
And I think I think people understand that, and they also want the context. Like, people complain all the time, "Oh, there's one nutrition study, and it says the opposite of the next one, and the next one is different." And there've been a lot of stories written about the difficulty of replicating certain kinds of studies. But that's okay. That's the process of science. So partly what scientists can do is educate people about how knowledge is created and developed. It's not just all in one moment.
That's great. So important. You also emphasize, Trish, that similarity is a vital precursor to communications. How do you do it? How do you establish that similarity? I completely agree. This similarity is often the need for similarity or connection is often overlooked when we're talking about persuasion or communication. But how does one establish similarity with an audience or a listener?
I mean, one of the things I found most interesting in my job in op ed was that we had some conservative writers who probably rightly assumed that a lot of the New York Times audience was liberal. And they would find ways to set up their pieces so that they would. I remember one that was about the lack of conservative social scientists in academia and basically proving that it was discrimination and not random chance. But it started out in such a way that it sort of said, we all believe in equal rights. Liberals do believe in equal rights. So then when you show that there's actual discrimination going on, it's, huh. So if you establish it depends on who your audience is. Different publications have very different audiences. But if you think about what will speak to that audience, that will help you establish that similarity.
Just shifting a little bit about from the message and the content to the messenger. We had a little chance to talk offline, and you were making some excellent points about the importance of the messenger and how, when it comes to scientists, they're actually the ones on the front lines and the kind of credibility or authority, or getting back to your point on expertise, how that carries so much weight.
Yeah, I think it carries a lot of weight, and I think people underestimate that. We got hundreds of op-eds that we were always rejecting because they were from people talking about other people's work, or they were from people talking about an area in which they really didn't have grounding. So I think if scientists think about what they know and how that relates to some larger issue at that moment, there's a lot of interest in what they have to say. They are a valid messenger.
Yep. And polling, I talk to when I talk to universities and societies, the Pew Research Center has done polling for years and years on the subject, and usually it's in order of credibility. It's medical doctors, it's the military, medical doctors, and then scientists. And way down below is politicians in the single digits.
Well, I think at the very bottom are journalists, which is what I've done forever. So journalists definitely aren't the best messengers. I think the hardest thing for scientists, they might be the appropriate messenger, but they might find it uncomfortable to write in a forum that's for a general audience because they're afraid they'll be devaluing the work or making it superficial. So that I saw that as a hurdle that a lot of people had trouble with. And they might not like to be edited because they're they worry rightly that their work can be distorted a little. And it might be, but if the gist of it gets out there, that's what you're after.
And we call it distilled but not dumbed down.
That's nice. Yeah, exactly.
This is another issue that's been out there for several years, and it's really a tough one. Let's just talk about it in the context of climate change. And I'm talking about sort of climate change deniers or science deniers more generally, because, you know, the book the book is really a powerful way to persuade, powerful techniques and tips, strategies to persuade. And what if you're confronted by people who they're always looking for conspiracy theories, or they're always buying into sort of alternative facts that aren't based on any evidence? How do you deal with people like that?
I think it's very challenging. I think in doing the research for this book, one of the most interesting things to me was that in a lot of ways, facts don't matter. You reach people with emotions and with stories and with similarity. But at the same time, there are occasions where facts do influence people, and the audiences really don't like it if your facts are wrong and it's in a field they know about. So facts have a weird sort of floating quality because at the same time, there's plenty of psychological research showing that's not the main thing that gets people to make up their mind. The main thing that gets them to decide a certain way is really what their family and friends are doing. On the other hand, one of the most effective ways, apparently, to give people facts that they will listen through to is through charts. So those things seem contradictory, but I happen to love charts. So I thought, do we all just like images? Is that the thing about a chart? I think the thing with alternative facts is that you don't want to repeat them and get into endless arguments about what's true and what's not true because it ends up seeming battering to the people you disagree with. I think you have to try to give examples of another way of looking at it in a kind of genteel way, and you have to be very persistent. And that is how you eventually create change.
Right. The expectation going in has to be this isn't going to be easy.
But the other thing is the change thing is fascinating because as I was doing this, change is so slow and it's hard to change people's minds. Then the whole Me Too movement came out of nowhere and spread very fast. Gay marriage happened relatively quickly in a cultural way. So sometimes things start and then they move very fast, and sometimes they don't. And it's very hard to determine what changes people's minds.
And Trish, as you had pointed out when we were chatting, this personal experience is a big factor. The examples that you gave, whether it's gay marriage or the Me Too movement, most people have personal experience with someone who's gay or lesbian. Most people, they have moms, they have sisters, maybe women in their lives. And so there is that personal connection to these larger policy.
And I think that makes those more real to people. And that's why things like climate change are more challenging. And so if you're trying to make someone understand where climate change might be going, you'll probably have a much easier time if their house was just submerged by water. It makes it real.
And you talk, this is really a very interesting section of your book when we raised the point about flattery. And it makes a lot of sense. It comes out of this similarity type of people wanting to talk about themselves and feel like you understand them or you're connected to them. You talk about how flattery is an important way to connect. But as you point out, the caveat is that the compliments need to be authentic. And so my question is, how does one go about establishing or showing authenticity?
I think that you should always think about how something would strike you if it was being aimed at you. So if someone said, I really like your haircut, but then they go on and on, you're like, oh, there's a certain excessiveness that people will sense is off. But just some honest compliments here and there are really helpful. There's this isn't really flattery, but one of the studies I found most interesting were these British researchers who looked over hundreds of hours of interviews between interrogators and terrorists or suspected terrorists. And they found that the ones who were really aggressive and tried to make them talk and threatened them, they didn't get anywhere. The ones who were empathetic and showed a certain kind of patience and that they were willing to listen and that they understood the other person's point of view, they were able to elicit information. There's a lot to be said for just it's a it's a combination of qualities, and flattery is one of them, that you can't make yourself the other person's enemy. You just won't get anywhere. There are a lot of things that appear contradictory to this. Obviously, the TV news world is very polarized, and there are people who only watch MSNBC and people only watch Fox. And but they're not convincing people who are different from them. They're just talking to their crowd. So I think it's important for people to understand if you want to just talk to your crowd, that's fine. But that's different from trying to actually persuade someone who may not agree with you.
hmm Yep. Yep. And I really, and part of maybe getting to this is something that you talk about in the book, and that's the importance of researching your listeners, researching the audience, person that you're talking to, if it's a one-on-one conversation. And I'm just curious, can you expand a bit on why research is important? And then maybe like, why don't more people do it when they think about wanting to persuade or communicate effectively?
I think if you look at the way debaters or high school debaters prepare, like they don't know which side of the argument they're going to have to present. It's really important to know there's a range of things you need to research. One is this particular publication, who reads it? What have they written on this subject? Because if you want to make a point that's different from what they have, you have the biggest odds of succeeding. But you also have to write it so that you understand if somebody's reading this and they're going to say, what about this? What about that? You have to know, you don't directly answer that, but you have to implicitly answer the objections and understand what they're likely to be. So that if you're writing about, I don't know, some example of what one of your listeners might be writing about, but what would be a good example that we could discuss? It's like you need to really know what the reader of that publication is going to be thinking so that you can present the argument before, so that, it's implicit in your piece, not in a pro and con and not in a debate form, but you just weave it into your writing or your presentation.
And maybe one example that I was just thinking about as you were talking, Trish, is up at Cornell, there's the Finger Lakes Center that helps on cancer. And one of the things that they do is they bring researchers from Cornell who are working on cancer and curing cancer, different types of cancers, to talk to patients, many of whom have either that type of cancer or they have friends and loved ones who are suffering with it. And talking to some of the researchers, I think part of it is that those types of conversations and understanding the audience that they're talking to, that can bring real meaning to their research as they go back to the bench and to their lab and are working on it. It also requires a lot of the skills that you were talking about earlier, the authenticity and the empathy and listening, which can be difficult, particularly in such a highly charged, emotionally charged environment like that.
Right. But yeah, I could see why it would be really valuable because then it makes you see the human consequences of your work.
Trish, this has been a fantastic conversation, interview, chance to have you talk a bit about this book that's out. I think it's a fantastic resource, like I said, and that's from someone I view myself as a persuasion nerd. I think that this is a great, very readable guide, and I appreciate you coming and on the show and talking about it and sharing your experiences. Just so valuable for our listeners.
Thank you so much. It was great to be here.
All right. I would encourage everyone, all our listeners, to come back next time for another edition of When Science Speaks. Thanks all for being here.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to click subscribe. Check us out on the web at whensciencespeaks.com, and we'll see you next time.